So this is, kind of like what we were saying. This is a weird topic to do. I was just telling Josh and Sienna, I was like, I think I was predicting everybody to show up to this because I feel like the title of this Sunday school was kind of like when you're on YouTube and you see a title and you're like, oh, that's a clickbait title right there. That's what I was hoping would happen. But that's okay. There's less people. That's okay. So we're going to try something a little bit different this morning. This is going to be very topical in the sense that we are kind of going in different places in history and different times in history. So it's not going to be like a flow from the New World and the Enlightenment that we talked about in the past couple weeks. But yeah, we thought that these were a couple of important topics to cover because they are deeply rooted in a false theology that was developed that affected the church for quite some time. And depending on where you are in the world, there will be hindrances and repercussions of this even till today, which is quite sad. So before we get into it, I wanted to read you guys a couple of quotes that I think you guys are just going to really resonate with, and you probably are going to really agree. Maybe. We'll see. All right. Okay. The tears of a woman are deception, for they may spring from true grief, or they may be a trap. When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. That's the first one. Second one. No one ever does more harm in the Catholic Church than midwives. For if they don't kill the children, they will take them out of the room and raising them up in the air, offer them to the devil. What do you guys think of that? These are quotes from the same person. And even greater yet, in your handout, do you have any extra handouts? Okay. Great. In your handout, there's a book that's referenced, that was published in 1486 called The Witch's Hammer. And it was by Heinrich Kramer. He was the author of these two quotes. And if you were to take the time and read The Witch's Hammer, it was very much an attempt to get rid of the problem of the witches that seemed to be springing up all over Europe, and then soon migrated into the New World as well. And the way that Heinrich Kramer went about doing this is he made a lot of blanket statements that got really carried away. And so in these blanket statements, he made the association that basically if women think independently, or if women, actually a lot of midwives, as I was reading that quote, had a susceptibility to become witches, or they were witches. And so as a response, we had to get rid of them. And so this book called The Witch's Hammer became one of the most influential guides for a number of centuries that caused people to basically have have a quote-unquote better understanding of the demonic world, specifically as it resulted with witches and women. So, believe it or not, if civilization wasn't misogynistic before, it was very misogynistic after. There was a tendency to really not like the independence of women. And there was a lot of reasons for this. It wasn't just the witch's hammer, but the witch's hammer did play quite the role in it. As you can see in your handout, from between the 1500s and the 1600s, tens of thousands of women were executed in Europe for witchcraft. And as we move to the New World, which we're just going to talk about very briefly, we hear about this town in Massachusetts called Salem. And in Salem, there is a very well-known event called, the Salem Witch Trials. That's right. And in the Salem Witch Trials, in that year, in 1692, 14 women and 6 men were hanged for witchcraft. Which is pretty wild, guys. And what I think is even more wild is that the reasons were very nuanced and vague. And the trials that they performed in order to figure out if they were lying or not were just brutal. And so there would be these accusations that came about. Basically, one of the main reasons why was because of a lack of a proper medical system. And so some people had gotten pretty good at figuring out how to deal with ailments. And if you have a lack of a medical understanding, another possible conclusion that you could reach is that you are creating magic spells to heal people. Potions, that's right, yeah. And so witches would have these, I can't remember what they're called, but they're basically guides who would be helping them craft these potions. And so some of these guides would take the form of black cats. And so in our contemporary Halloween image of a witch, we get a lot of those images from actually the witch's hammer. So I think is pretty interesting. So that was the lack of a medical system. Proper medical understanding was a big one. Also, if you didn't like people, you could just accuse them of witchcraft. So say, for example, maybe I should. So say, for example, David loaned me a whole bunch of money, and I did not pay David back. As a response, David could go before the authorities and say, yeah, Pastor Jordan, he's a witch, because I saw him create these concoctions. And the way that they would figure out if I was a witch or not, it varied depending on Europe and Salem. But one of the ways that they did it was they would tie a rock to your leg, and they would just push you in the lake. If you floated, you were a witch, but if you did not, you were not a witch. Now, to be clear, if you did not float, the idea would be that somebody would jump in and save you before you drowned. The problem was, they did not always get there in time. And so there would be straight up murders that would happen before the masses of the people because they couldn't get there in time, because even though they were innocent, they're like, oh shoot, we didn't get to them in time. They're at the bottom of a lake. Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of hindsight things that they probably didn't think of at the time. And so what I wanted to do, I actually didn't want to spend too much time with Salem, because I wanted to spend, quite a bit more time with the slave trade. But what I want to do is I want to just open up for some questions, to see how do you guys respond to this idea with witches, with Salem, with the witch's hammer, modern day witches? We could talk about that a little bit. Do you guys have any questions about that? Any thoughts? Are you like, oh, all medical system is just hidden witchcraft?
I had an experience with my half-sister that kind of freaked me out, made me wonder about her, but essentially what she did is she had learned how to hypnotize quite easily her son. Son's name was John. And I experienced this, when she hypnotized him one time, she took him back to the womb, and as he was laying on the couch, he curled up in the fetal position. And then she brought him from the womb to birth. And you would just see him stretch, almost like you see a little baby stretch. And the not being able to understand this and kind of wonder, is this put on? Is this and clearly it wasn't, but so many things go through your head when you don't understand something that you can label and misidentify many things. And it's just an experience I went through that, much like people back in the day with witches, they didn't understand it, they were scared of it, and had to do away with it.
Anybody else? Thoughts? Okay, what I will say before we move on is that I do believe that witchcraft is still a thing today. And I do believe that witchcraft was a thing during times like the Salem witch trials, during times like when the witch's hammer was a very prevalent book. And I would go as far as saying that some of the reasons and motivations why Heinrich Kramer wrote this book was because of legitimate times where he saw demonic experience being played out in a form of witchcraft. Okay? I think that for us to, it's kind of like what we were talking about last week, the Enlightenment, for us to just say that everything's natural, and everything, there's no spiritual left, is very dangerous for us if we swing too far in that pendulum. But I think that there needs to be more careful discernment and prayer when it comes to some of the things that we're experiencing today. Like, for example, hypnotism, right? It's an interesting thing, and I will be honest, it makes me feel very uncomfortable. And so I think that there is a level of trust that we can have with our convictions and with a knowledge of how the world works, like the medical system, that can greatly benefit us more than it did 500 years ago, 400 years ago. So, yeah.
Yeah. When I was in grade 12 here in Lorette, CLC, I had a conversation. Well, there's actually a girl, I think she was in grade 10 at the time. She had approached me wondering if I'd be willing to talk about my faith with her. She was curious about. She knew I was a Christian. She was curious what She had a long list of questions to ask me, and so we found a time that worked. And yeah, she had a bunch of questions to ask me relating different things about the Christian faith and all that. But what fascinated me in this whole thing was she told me about an experience that had piqued her interest in the Christian faith. And so she told me very, very plainly and unhesitatingly that she summons spirits, and in her room she has all the books and how to do it and everything, and she has a salt circle that I think the idea is that the spirits that you summon will be contained within this space in her room. And she was explaining to me how sometimes spirits come and she's terrified, and she's so glad that they're contained in the salt circle. And she had an experience where she's convinced that it was Jesus that showed up. And I believe she described him as appearing as a young boy. And she didn't say much about it, but she did mention that she felt totally comfortable, totally peaceful, like she didn't need to have any of those defenses set up. But it was just a calm presence. And so, very interesting.
All right. So again, very topical, just touching on that. And the reason why we're not spending too much time on it is because when it comes to the two things of slavery and witches, and how it affected us today and how it affected people, slavery is quite a bit more significant, I would say, especially when we're talking about the New World. So we're going to move into that now. A main kind of starting point that has helped me as I was doing some research on this is the reminder that slavery was not just being done by the Europeans and the Americans. It wasn't just like this thing that the Europeans were like, oh, you know what's a great idea that we haven't thought of before? Making slaves and enslaving people. Well, there was a lot of people that were doing that. Africa was a very hot spot, continent for basically coming in and capturing people. And it was happening in the Americas, in the European, for the Europeans. It was also happening for the Arabic people in the Caribbean. But it was also happening within Africa itself. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to focus primarily on slavery as it happens in the New World, kind of where we are right now. And yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit about how, what are some of the main reasons for it. And then we'll talk about what are the fruits of their labor. And then we'll talk a little about the reasons why it became more prominent in the South. We'll give some numbers for you guys, and then we'll talk about the theology of it, because I think that's an important thing, especially as we're talking about church history. How did people justify slavery, and how can we respond to it today? So. All right, so the fruit of their labor is going to be a main one. Actually, we're gonna follow with the handouts. That'll be a bit easier for us. So the first thing we can talk about is some numbers. So in 1600 to 1700, it was estimated that there was 18 to 20,000 slaves that were sent to the American colonies. And the population of the colonies at that time was 280,000 approximately. And so by 1830, there were 2 million slaves that were in America. And to give you a bit of an image, 12 million people lived in America. So that is a very large population of slaves. And these slaves were primarily from Africa. One thing that, I thought was interesting, I didn't know this. There wasn't actually a very large population of slaves from the indigenous people in the New World. A very unfortunate reality is that when the colonizers came from Europe to the New World, they had gone through a very large disease that had caused their immune system to strengthen a lot. They'd gone through the generation that was the Black Plague. And because of that, their descendants had a stronger immune system. But the problem was there was still remnants of these major diseases like the Black Plague that came over into the New World. And so when they came over, it was estimated about like 80% or more of the indigenous population died off because they just didn't have the immune system to handle the European colonizers coming. So. It is important for us to realize that slavery was very beneficial for the American colonies, especially in the South. So in the South, they had a larger amount of crops like cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco that people in Europe didn't have. They had no idea what this crop was, but they knew, and they discovered that this crop was very lucrative. All of a sudden, you can now take tobacco and you can smoke it, and that became a very, very lucrative business. Cotton affected the clothing that people wore. It affects it even now. And sugarcane, that's where we get this pure form of sugar. And in the southern colonies, they had a lot of it. And so they realized two things. It was very lucrative, but it was very hard to harvest. And it took a lot of manpower to harvest. And things like the Industrial Revolution had not happened yet. So that meant that they were stuck with doing it by hand. And if they relied only on the colonizers to come and do that, I would venture to suggest that the South would not be as rich as they are now. But instead, they took slaves and they brought them over on ships from Africa, and they put them to hard labor. And so there was a saying that came up in America very early on called land of the free. That's probably pretty well known for us now. And what's wrong with that saying? Right. Land of the free for whom, right? For everybody who wasn't a slave. So it's like, oh, great. If you're not a slave, then you're free. And it's the land of the free, except for the slaves. One of the major reasons, we're not going to get into it, but one of the major reasons for the Civil War happening in the States had to do with slavery. That wasn't the only reason, but it was definitely one of them, because there was so much of a divide with the northern colonies and the southern colonies that they were just saying, like you shouldn't be enslaving people. This is ridiculous. And it got to the point that it was so, Yeah, I mean, like the numbers that we talked about, right? 2 million slaves that were in America. It was so lucrative of a thing that it began very quickly trickling into the church as well. And I mean, whether or not the church was still had as much power as they once did, they definitely did not. But people were still wanting to get some justification for what they were doing. And what better justification that they could get than going to the church? And the church was more than happy to justify, especially in the South, slavery. I thought I had a number down here. Oh, that's too bad. I had a number down here for the amount of Methodists. Oh yeah, here we go. In 1843, for example, there was over 1,000 Methodist ministers and preachers who owned slaves in the South. Isn't that crazy? I think that's crazy. Just a couple of facts about why we don't practice slavery anymore. In 1833, a man by the name of William Wilberforce spearheaded what was called the Emancipation Act, and that was in the British colonies in the British Empire, and that abolished slavery. In 1863, looking at the New World, we have anybody who spearheaded the Emancipation Act and abolished slavery? Anybody know in the States? Abraham Lincoln, that's right. In 1863 that happened, and in 1865 it became completely abolished in America. So interesting thing to look at. It was somewhat abolished. Oh wait, sorry, it was abolished in the northern states, but it took 2 years until it became fully abolished, even in the southern states. Yeah. And then he was assassinated, right. So it's, yeah, oh yeah, that is a rabbit hole. But there is, it was an interesting worldview because they were allowing slaves and they were saying that it was biblically justifiable. And so now we're going to turn to these biblical justifiable principles. So if you were a minister in the 19th century, if you're a Methodist minister in the South, one of the South colonies, and you were trying to justify the fact that you owned a bunch of slaves at home, what would be some verses that you would use to justify it? Oh, okay, so slaves obey your masters. Okay, yep. Anything else? Any other verse? What? Is there any verses? Any people? Hey? Philemon, right. What's Philemon about? That's right, yeah. It's like, oh, okay, you can use that, yeah. When you look at the Old Testament, there were these patriarchs that we know very well, like Abraham, who had slaves. Abraham even went as far as making one of his slaves sleep with him to procreate. Yeah, so the law in Leviticus that we're going to talk about in a second of, if you were too poor, you could sell yourself as a slave. And then after a certain amount of time, you were set free. There was, oh yeah, this is a doozy of a one. So a theology that had been developed was that in Genesis 9, 20 to 27, right after the flood, Noah curses Ham. And there was a theology that was developed that that curse was darker skin. And because you had that darker skin, you were from Africa, and so you were a cursed person, so you were actually not a full person. So that was one deeply unfortunate reality. The other deeply unfortunate reality is, it was something that I would actually suggest still affects whether or not we do cross-cultural missions today. And that is, it was called the salvation justification. And that basically was saying that these Africans who had never been Christianized, which isn't quite fully true, but these Africans who had never been Christianized are being saved by the Europeans. And once they came in and colonized Africa and ripped out the people out of Africa, the people were no longer able to read any of their works. They weren't allowed to worship any of their gods. And the only thing that they could read and have access to was the Bible. That is such a travesty. But it's also, it has like trickles of good things in it. Because it is true. The reality is they were able to experience Jesus. But their image of Jesus was from these white colonizers coming and ripping them out of their homes. Yeah, and so there are definitely noticeable parallels to things like the 60s scoop and the residential schools that I think are definitely worth taking note of for sure. One thing I will say to that, so much here. Okay, I'm gonna hold your question, Evan. I'm gonna get 3 people to read from Scripture. Can I get one person to read Leviticus 25, 44 to 46? Michael, Deuteronomy 15, 12 to 15. Carolee, and then Galatians 3:28. Evan. Okay, yeah. Okay, Leviticus 25. Sorry. Oh, there it is.
Verse what?
44 to 46.
Ooh. Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25, 44 to 46. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule, one over another ruthlessly.
Okay, what is that passage saying? You can have slaves, but treat them well, and also they can't be Jewish. Okay, so those are important things to remember.
Deuteronomy 15:12 to 15. If your brother a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years. And in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress, as the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this today.
Okay, what's that saying? You can have Hebrew slaves. And now there's a difference that's going on here. That's right. After how long? 6 years. That's right. Okay, so now there's a bit of a difference here. Okay. All right, so now we're going to the New Testament. So this is kind of like the one that you want to really listen to.
Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
What's it saying? There's no slaves in the sense that you shouldn't, I would say, recognize them as slaves. There can be people that work for you, but your image of slavery is different. And so, okay, I just want to pick up on a few things here. In Evan's passage, who is it talking about specifically? Believers, okay? As Christian colonizers who came to Europe, who came to Africa and took the people out of Africa and gave them the Bible, hoping that they would be saved. What happens when they are saved? Why? Because there isn't a slave or free. You are all one in Christ. And so, there was this, I don't even know, maybe they just didn't even read this verse. Seriously, I have no idea how they got there. But there is this idea, and even if you read the Old Testament passages like Michael or Carolee were reading, what kind of image of a slave do you get in your head? One who's being mistreated and struck down? No. You get one who's actually getting treated well. And then after 6 years, they have the option, the slave does, mind you, they have the option of either staying with their owner or being freed. And if you were a Jewish slave, when you got freed, you were supposed to be taken care of. And so now, as we move into the New Testament and bring in this image of Christ, if you're going to try to justify this idea of slavery, to the very least, your slaves, which culturally in the first century it was different, so we need to take that in consideration. But the people who work for you, I'll just say that, they need to be treated well. And this was not what was happening here. And so, something that was very interesting that the African American people developed is this theology of being free from their bonds. And so they would read the Bible that these colonizers would they would just give them. And they didn't just read the Bible, they were formed by it. It was transforming their life. And it was by solely the grace of God, because it sure wasn't anything to do with these guys who were beating them all the time. And so they were developing this theology that we can actually be free in Christ. That the chains that are literally binding us together will one day be broken. And so images of the year of Jubilee in the Old Testament became very prevalent for the African American. Images of the Exodus from Egypt became very prevalent. All of these images of being delivered out of slavery into a new creation, that was so rich for us to understand. And when we look at these people and the atrocities that happened, like, by the grace of God, we can actually see some of these further theological images that we've taken into our day that have greatly molded and shaped us. This image of being no longer shackled down. What an image. What an image. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for this morning, so hope you guys have a great week. Go in peace.